Welcome everyone to this captivating and spine-chilling story. I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to the person who submitted this tale for sharing their personal experience and bringing it to life for us all to enjoy. I am also deeply grateful to all of you who have taken the time to listen, for lending your ears and immersing yourselves in this eerie and mysterious journey. The woods can be a place of wonder and beauty, but as this story illustrates, they can also be a place of uncertainty and unease. I hope this story serves as a reminder to always be prepared and aware when venturing into the wilds of nature. Without further ado, allow me to begin this tale. In my cultural tradition, it is believed that there exist spiritual entities within the natural environment, particularly in wooded areas. These entities, often referred to as spirits, are thought to possess the ability to block an individual's path, thereby preventing them from leaving the area. This is said to occur as a means of seeking companionship from the individual. It is believed that when this occurs, the spirit will use its influence to create an infinite loop in the trail, causing the individual to become trapped in a cycle of returning to the same location, despite their attempts to leave. This story takes place in the Spring Hills region of Florida and its surrounding environs. My family and I had set out into the woods in search of edible mushrooms. Once we arrived, we divided into smaller groups and agreed to reconvene at a designated location. My mother, who is elderly and of fragile health, chose to navigate a trail that she was familiar with, opting to do so alone as she felt confident in her knowledge of the area. As she engaged in the task of gathering mushrooms, my mother noted that this particular experience felt different from all previous occasions she had visited this location. She described a feeling of being followed, as if someone were mimicking her actions and collecting the mushrooms that she had missed from behind. Despite checking her surroundings and finding herself to be alone, the sensation persisted. She attributed the sensation to the likely presence of a small mammal such as a squirrel or another animal in the vicinity. Moments after my mother dismissed her suspicions of being followed, she witnessed a figure of a woman materialize from behind the large tree ahead of her, strolling towards a nearby stream. The woman's back was towards my mother, and she initially assumed it to be one of the other members of our party. My mother attempted to make her presence known by whistling in an attempt to gain the woman's attention, but to no avail. The woman did not respond, continuing on her journey towards the stream. My mother, keen to verify the identity of the woman, set off in pursuit but was unable to catch up with her. As my mother arrived at the stream, the mysterious lady was nowhere to be found. However, she discovered a collection of mushrooms that had been picked and arranged neatly on a brown rock, surrounded by tall yellow bushes. Initially believing them to be the work of the woman she had encountered earlier, she called out the names of her daughters and the other members of their group, but received no response. Assuming that one of the members of our group had simply forgotten the mushrooms and left them behind, my mother collected them and added them to her own basket of foraged mushrooms, without giving it much further thought. As my mother set out to gather mushrooms along the scenic stream, she traversed the rocky terrain and her basket soon brimming with her foraged find. Upon realizing that it was time to return to the designated meeting point, she retraced her steps, carefully navigating the hills and mountains, with thoughts of how she would utilize her bountiful harvest upon returning home. She could already imagine being home by the door, and her grandson approaching her asking if she found any mushrooms because he loved her mushroom soup. However, as she continued on her journey, she began to feel a sense of trouble. She found herself repeatedly returning to the same location where she had encountered a mysterious woman earlier in her journey, and where she had first collected the mushrooms. Recognizing that she had become lost, my mother was initially in disbelief. She retraced her steps multiple times but always ended up back at the stream. Despite her familiarity with the area, she found it impossible to orient herself and find her way back to the meeting point. My mother grew increasingly panicked, as the sky was awash with the vibrant hues of the setting sun, and the sounds of the woods around her grew quieter. The more she thought about it, the more her anxiety increased, as she grappled with the reality of her situation. As soon as my mother became aware of her disorientation and realized she was lost, she reported experiencing a sense of being watched or observed. Throughout her wandering, she heard rustling leaves and snapping twigs as if something was following her. But upon turning to investigate, she could only see what appeared to be a large black figure in the periphery of her vision, but upon closer inspection, it turned out to be either a log or boulder. Despite her efforts to navigate her surroundings, my mother found herself traversing in circular patterns, continually returning to the same spot at the stream. She reported that even as she consciously attempted to take different paths, she found herself unable to deviate from this circular trajectory. In her effort to find her way out of the forest, my mother reported seeing one of her aunts walking a few feet from her. She was overjoyed and thought that she had finally found a way out of her predicament. She immediately called out to her aunt, using her name and screaming as loud as she could, trying to get her attention. But to her dismay, no matter how much she yelled and tried to make noise, her aunt couldn't hear her. She said it was as if she was walking in a completely different dimension or plane. Her aunt was physically present, but the sound couldn't reach her. My mother described her aunt's expression as indifferent, as if she was in a trance. This only made my mother feel like she was trapped in a nightmare, that there was something blocking her communication with the outside world. The experience left her feeling even more disoriented, lost, and hopeless. As my mother's situation became increasingly dire, she found herself becoming overwhelmed with fear. She began to cry and called out the names of her friends and family, but received no response. The silence of the woods, with the birds and animals settling down for the night, made her voice echo back to her, adding to her fear. The once familiar woods now felt eerie and unfamiliar. As her fear and panic reached a peak, in a moment of desperation, my mother cried out, "If there is someone or something blocking my path, I demand that you stop now and show me the way. It is getting late and I must return home." Despite the strength and determination in her words, her inner turmoil was palpable. Her voice shook, and she found it difficult to remain still, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. This moment marked a turning point for her, from a calm and determined person to someone who was filled with fear and uncertainty, trapped in a situation that she couldn't escape. After expressing her frustration for an extended period, my mother suddenly remembered the mushrooms she had collected near the stream. She recalled a belief from her cultural tradition that one should not take objects that do not belong to them, especially in the woods, as it could be seen as an acknowledgement of an acceptance of the presence of spiritual entities. Realizing that she had picked up the mushrooms, and thereby potentially acknowledged the presence of an unseen being, my mother sat down and deeply apologized for her actions. She laid down the mushrooms she had collected, including the ones she had taken near the stream, and clearly communicated that she did not want them anymore and was returning them to the rightful owner. My mother repeatedly begged the entity blocking her to let her leave and return home, as the sky was getting darker, and she didn't have any light. She spent another 5 minutes apologizing, kneeling down on her knees, and begging for forgiveness. My mother then got up and tried finding the way back home again, but it was getting dark, and she had no flashlight or other light sources to aid her. She randomly chose a path and decided to follow it in hope of finding the way. As my mother set out once more on her journey, her hope renewed, she began traversing the dense underbrush with the determined intention of finding her way back home. As she pressed forward, the rustling leaves and snapping twigs beneath her feet were interrupted by a familiar female voice calling out her name, Julia. My mother was taken aback, as she had not expected anyone to know her name in these remote woods, and paused to carefully listen for the source of the voice. As she turned to investigate, she perceived a figure in the distance, holding a flashlight, and the person was calling her name again with increasing urgency. My mother felt a sense of relief wash over her as she realized that someone was there to aid her in her predicament. She quickened her pace and ran towards the person, her heart pounding with hope. As she drew closer, she was able to make out the features of the person, and to her great relief, she recognized her sister-in-law, who had apparently heard her pleas and prayers and had come to guide her back to safety. My mother approached the figure she believed to be her sister-in-law, and she saw the relief and concern etched on her supposed relative's face. The individual claiming to be her sister-in-law stated that she had heard her pleas and prayers and had come to take her home, as her son was reported to be unwell. My mother, initially overwhelmed with relief, began to feel a sense of unease as she drew closer to the figure. As she got closer, she noticed several discrepancies in the supposed sister-in-law's appearance and behavior. The voice of the figure had a strange ethereal quality to it, and her eyes seemed to glint in the darkness in an otherworldly way. My mother remembered that her sister-in-law had not accompanied her on the trip, as she had been unable to take time off from work. This realization, coupled with the eerie features of the figure before her, led my mother to suspect that this was not her sister-in-law, but rather an otherworldly entity masquerading as her relative. Recalling the traditional beliefs passed down by her elders, my mother remembered the notion that by turning around and looking between one's legs, the true form of any person or spirit could be revealed. Acting quickly, she turned and peered through her legs, and to her dismay, she discovered that the figure before her was not her sister-in-law, but rather a spectral woman with long and disheveled hair that obscured her face and reached her feet. The woman was laughing in a mocking manner, although my mother could not see her face due to the hair obscuring it. The posture and head movements of the figure indicated amusement. Overcome with fear and a sense of dread, my mother turned and fled, not daring to glance back until the ghostly apparition was out of sight. Suddenly, as she traversed through the dense forest, a new trail emerged before her out of seemingly thin air. Although initially hesitant, she had little choice but to follow the path, as it was her only means of progression. The trail was long and narrow, with trees crowding the path on either side. As she walked, she could hear the distant sound of a stream, and soon she came upon a small stream that flowed across the trail. She carefully stepped over it and continued on. After some time, the trail opened up to a plain of tall grass, and in the distance, she could see a campfire and a man sitting beside it. He was turned away from her, and she could not see his face. The man was dressed in long white robes, and his hair was also long and white, some of it spilling out from the hood of his robe. She drew near, and the man stood up to face her, his brows lowered, creating a furrowed appearance on his forehead that made his eyes appear more focused, suggesting that he was trying to understand the situation and figure out what was going on. With a deep and perplexed voice, he asked my mom what she was doing there, and then after a brief pause, he said with a steady voice, "You have my permission to leave. You are free to go home." Before my mom could answer, a woman's shriek broke the silence behind her. She quickly turned to see who had made the noise, but before she could, she woke up from her dream. My mother woke up from her dream, realizing that the ghost lady and the man and the fire were just a figment of her dream. She looked to her right and saw the mushrooms that she had gathered earlier and had placed on the ground beside her. Realizing that she had fallen asleep while kneeling and praying for a way back home, she felt a sense of disorientation wash over her. As she got up and surveyed her surroundings, she noticed that the sun was beginning to set and the forest was taking on a gloomy appearance. She attempted to retrace her steps in an effort to find her way back to the meeting spot with her family. To her surprise, she discovered that the trail leading back to her destination had been there all along, and she couldn't believe that she had overlooked it earlier. Feeling both relieved and worried, my mother didn't waste a moment. She set off at a fast pace, her footsteps pounding in time with her racing heart. She kept her eyes trained on the trail ahead as she ran, determined to make it back to her family as quickly as possible. Despite the fatigue and confusion she felt from her dream, her strong will and determination to be reunited with her loved ones pushed her forward. My mother ran and the forest passed by in a blur, and soon she saw familiar landmarks that indicated she was getting close to her destination. She could see the smoke from the campfire, and as she rushed towards her destination, my mother once again felt a sense of unease wash over her. It was the same sinister feeling that had gripped her when she first arrived at this place, as if someone was watching her. Suddenly she heard a woman's scream, identical to the one she heard in her dream. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was still a dream, that none of this was real. Just as she was about to reach her destination, my mother made the fateful decision to glance over her shoulder to make sure that nothing was following her. It was the biggest mistake of her life, as upon turning back, she saw a dark, hideous face with long curly hair peek out from behind a tree. It was the ghost of a woman, grave and angry that my mother was leaving. The ghost seemed unable to move from her spot, as if something was holding her there. My mother was horrified and panicked, She felt the ghost was trying to stop her from leaving. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear, her legs pumping furiously beneath her. She didn't dare look back, knowing that the ghostly apparition was likely still there, watching her every move. Upon arrival at the designated meeting spot, my mother's family members were relieved and overjoyed to see her safe and sound. However, in her haste to reach them, my mother had inadvertently run into one of her sisters, and both of them had tumbled to the ground. Tears streaming down her face as she laid there, and her family initially believed that she was crying from the fall. Little did they know, she had just been through an incredibly harrowing and terrifying experience. Once they had both gotten back to their feet, her family members inquired as to why she had taken so long to return, and why she had been crying. But my mother was still visibly shaken and petrified, was initially unable to explain what had occurred. As they traveled back home, the feeling that the ominous entity was still watching her lingered, and my mother was unable to shake off the feeling of terror and dread. It wasn't until they had dropped her off at home that she finally felt safe enough to share her experience with her family. She explained that she had encountered a ghost that had prevented her from leaving the area. She stated that she would never again go back to that location with them, and urged her family not to return there as well. Her story not only left her family members in shock, but it also became a cautionary tale for them to be more cautious and aware when going to pick mushrooms in the future. According to some belief systems, spirits or entities that reside in the woods have the ability to block or prevent individuals from leaving the area. They may do this because they are lonely and wish for the person to stay with them. This can lead to the feeling of being trapped and unable to find a way out, regardless of which path or trail is taken. In the case of my mother's experience, it is possible that the man by the fire that she saw in her dream was a protector. It could have been one of her ancestors or a guardian spirit of the woods, who heard her pleas and prayers for help and came to guide her back to safety. On the other hand, the dark-faced ghost that my mother saw behind the tree may have represented the evil entity that sought to trap her in the woods. The woods can be a mysterious and often unsettling place, and I hope that this story has helped to capture some of that eerie atmosphere. As we have seen in this story, when venturing out into the wilderness, it is important to take precautions and be aware of the potential dangers. It is recommended to always let someone know your plans, carry a form of communication and a map, and be aware of the surrounding environment. It's also important to remember that you're a guest in the forest, and it's important to respect the natural habitat and not interfere with it. Most importantly, if you find yourself lost, it's essential to stay calm and not to panic. Remember, the best way to stay safe in the woods is to be prepared and stay aware of your surroundings. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.